Golden Oldies from the Toll House in Lancaster, Part 1. My tribute to James Peter Greaves. I want to remember this great player as he was, always smiling with a wonderful impish sense of humour, and for this reason I will not be showing photographs of him in a wheelchair after his devastating stroke. His wife Irene was a major part of his story, and I feel the photograph taken in 1965 shows a blissfully happy couple who were married for 63 years. The greatest thing about Jimmy Greaves was the gap between him and everybody else. It was as big as the Grand Canyon. During his descent into alcoholism, she was the rock that kept the family together. Jimmy Greaves is to goal scoring what Elvis Presley was to rock and roll. He was the king. Jimmy married Irene at the Romford Register Office on March 26, 1958. They separated at the height of his alcoholism for 3 months and went through a divorce process that was never finalised. Early days. Jimmy at the age of 9, a ragamuffin. At Kingswood School with teacher Glyn Bateman, who encouraged Jimmy with his studies and football. Was Jimmy different to us? Society and the world have changed, but Jimmy's life was exactly what we all experienced growing up after World War II. He would kick a tennis ball around for hours in the backyard. Jimmy and his mates like Dave Emmerich played football in the street until the tennis ball went bald and still carried on. Jimmy's dad was treasurer of Fanshawe All Boys, a local amateur team. When the team bought a new leather football, the old one was passed to Jimmy, who immediately became popular with everyone. Saturday morning pictures, Laurel and Hardy, Mickey Mouse and Flash Gordon. He read the Beano, Dandy, Rover and Hotspur comics. We were all the same apart from not having his outstanding football ability. On the radar of professional clubs. In 1955 he had trials for Essex and London schoolboys. Jimmy Thompson, who always wore a bowler hat, had run foul of football authorities for poaching young players and used a variety of aliases. He approached Jimmy and introduced himself as Mr. Pope. Jimmy earned his living by scouting for Chelsea, as well as placing bets for jockeys, trainers and football players, all illegal. West Ham and Tottenham were showing a keen interest in Jimmy, and Arthur Rowe had spoken to Jimmy's dad about signing for Spurs, and he agreed to it. But Tottenham unfortunately missed their chance of signing Jimmy when manager Arthur Rowe went into hospital, and sadly he had to resign because of his illness. Tea in the West End. One afternoon Thompson turned up at the Greaves home in his blood-red Sunbeam Talbot, driven by his daughter, as he didn't drive. They took Jimmy to the Strand Palace Hotel in the West End, where they had afternoon tea, leaving the youngster very impressed. Returning to the Greaves home, Thompson had a long chat with Jimmy's dad and agreed that he would sign for Chelsea. 2 weeks later, Jimmy Greaves arrived at Stamford Bridge and became one of Drake's ducklings, a reference to manager Ted Drake. The paperwork was processed by Chelsea secretary John Battersby. Remember his name, as it will come back to Jimmy in the future. Jimmy was to work in the office for £3 a week, plus £2 accommodation money, which went straight to his mother as he lived at home. Chelsea, a music hall joke. Jimmy leaving the Chelsea office is seen in the photograph. The poor state of the brickwork shows how poverty-stricken the club were. Famous comedian Max Miller would often include a joke about Chelsea in his stage routine. Max was a Chelsea fan but would tell his audience Chelsea are building a new stand at Stamford Bridge, but the architect has made a serious mistake. The stand is facing the pitch. Youth football for Jimmy. In the 55-56 season, Jim scored 51 goals. In the 56-57 season, he scored 122 goals under the tutelage of Dickie Foss. The youth team trained on the greyhound track behind one of the goals, and rarely, if ever, saw the manager. It was a wet and windy Monday morning when the figure of Ted Drake appeared out of the mist and headed straight for the young Jimmy Greaves and shook his hand. The conversation of Jimmy and Ted. "I hear you scored 7 on Saturday against Crystal Palace, son," said Ted. "Yes, Mr. Drake," replied an astonished Jimmy. "Did you know I once scored 7 in a game, son?" "Yes, Mr. Drake, everyone knows about the 7 you scored at Villa Park in a 7-1 win for Arsenal, as well as hitting the post twice in the same game. Scoring 7 goals in a game happens once in a lifetime, and for a very, very select few. Cherish the memory, for it won't happen again," said Ted. In Jimmy's next game against Fulham, he scored 8. Would Jimmy be offered a contract? Towards the end of the 56-57 season, Ted Drake called Jimmy into his office and told him he was undecided about offering him a contract, despite the fact he had scored 122 goals. Jimmy was concerned because 12 months earlier Ted had released a young player called Joe Baker, who Ted thought didn't have a future in the game. How wrong a manager can be was proved when Joe Baker signed for Hibernian before moving to Torino and then to Arsenal. When Jimmy came out of the office, he met his girlfriend Irene and they walked towards the bus stop. Jimmy Thompson pulled up in his Sunbeam and sensed that Jimmy was down in the dumps and asked him what was the matter. Jimmy Thompson confronts Ted Drake. "Ted Drake doesn't want to sign me," said Jimmy. Thompson had just returned from a racing trip to Ireland, but he jumped out of his car and made a beeline for Drake's office. 10 minutes later, Thompson came out and told Jimmy, "Chelsea will offer you a full-time contract at £8 a week and £7 in the summer." Jimmy's parents were overjoyed at the news, but his dad questioned why he wasn't being given a signing-on fee. Jimmy Thompson was speechless, went out to his car, and when he returned he gave Jimmy's dad a large brown envelope. Inside were 10 Irish £5 notes. Jimmy Thompson had paid the fee out of his own pocket to sign the greatest goal scorer in 150 years of British football. Youth Cup Final 1958. Jimmy scored in both legs of the 58 FA Youth Cup Final against Wolves. Chelsea won 5-1 at Stamford Bridge on April 29, 1958. Wolves shocked Chelsea at Molineux on May 1st, 1958 by winning 6-1, and of course Greaves scored the sole Chelsea goal. First Division debut, August 24th, 1957. Greaves scored in a 1-1 draw at White Hart Lane, becoming an instant success, and would score in all his debut games. Greaves showed ball control, confidence and the positional strength of a seasoned campaigner, and his impact on the game was similar to Duncan Edwards as a teenager, causing Johnny Haynes, captain of England, to say, No player has ever had such cold finishing power. August 1957, Spurs won apiece against Chelsea. September 57, England under-23s 6-2 against Bulgaria. October 57, London 11 against Lausanne Sport 2-0. May 59, Peru 4-1 for England. August 61, Lanerossi Vicenza 0-3 to AC Milan. December 61, Spurs 5, Blackpool 2. March 1970, Man City 1, West Ham 5. Chelsea finished 11th in the First Division. In 57-58, Greaves was the club's top scorer with 22 goals in 37 appearances. Ted Drake rested him for 6 weeks in November and December 1957, as he did not want the praise to go to Jimmy's head. So how many goals would he have scored in those missing weeks? Greaves marked his return to the first team at Stamford Bridge with 4 goals in a 7-4 victory over Portsmouth on Christmas Day. Chelsea scored 83 and conceded 79 to finish 11th in the First Division. New season, same old problems. Greaves scored 5 goals at Stamford Bridge in a 6-2 win against league champions Wolves in the third match of the 58-59 season. Wolves only conceded 49 goals during the whole season, and Jimmy was responsible for 5. Jimmy gave the Wolves defence a torrid time, including England skipper Billy Wright. Jimmy was the First Division's top scorer with 32 goals in 42 league games. Chelsea scored 77 goals but conceded an unbelievable 98 and finished in 14th place. Only relegated Portsmouth conceded more, 112. This was the season that Charlie Mitten, who was manager of Newcastle, wanted to buy Jimmy for £25,000, but the Newcastle board turned him down. Downward path continues in 59-60, but tragedy strikes in October 1960. Jimmy came to Deepdale and scored 5 goals in a thrilling 5-4 victory over Preston North End. Once again, he had scored 29 goals in 40 league games. Chelsea could only manage an 18th place finish in the league, 3 points and 3 places above the relegation zone. On Wednesday, October 26, 1960, England beat Spain 4-2 at Wembley, with Greaves, Brian Douglas and Bobby Smith with 2 scoring. And the next day, his lifelong friend Dave Emerick called to see him, and when Jimmy opened the door, he was in floods of tears. His young son Jimmy had been suffering from pneumonia, and Jimmy and Irene had discovered him dead in his cot that morning at 4 months old. Greaves said little Jimmy's death devastated us. It nearly drove us out of our minds. We were inconsolable. When reporters asked Jimmy after England won the World Cup in 1966 if it was the worst day of his life, this was the reason, he said, a resounding no. Dave Emerick said the young couple never got over the tragedy. Jimmy could not stop scoring in 60-61. Jimmy scored hat-tricks against Wolves, Blackburn Rovers and Manchester City. His 100th league goal on November 19, 1960. Then he scored 4 goals against Newcastle United and 4 more against Nottingham Forest. Next one was 5 goals against West Bromwich Albion. Chelsea finished in 12th place. conceded 100 goals and only relegated Newcastle with 109 exceeded that. Jimmy was becoming increasingly disillusioned after scoring 41 goals in 40 league games for one of the worst teams in the top division of English football. Top scorer in the first division for the second time. Jimmy Greaves' record at Chelsea. 132 goals in 169 games for a very, very poor team. Made his first team debut against Spurs in 57-58, age 17, and scored. Scored 13 hat-tricks, including 5 in a game 3 times and 4 in a game 3 times. In November 1960, he scored his 100th league goal at the age of 20 years and 290 days, a league record. His final game for Chelsea was the last game of the 60-61 season. He was made captain before he departed to play for AC Milan in Italy for £80,000. Chelsea beat Notts Forest 4-3 and Jimmy scored all 4 goals. A true legend of the game, and so much more to come, but not at Chelsea. Second thoughts for Jimmy and Irene. Jimmy and Irene, having thought about Italy, became unhappy with the decision they had made and asked for a meeting with Joe Mears, Ted Drake and Secretary John Battersby. Jim told them he was very much a boy from East London and worried about moving his family to Italy. Jimmy pleaded and begged Joe Mears to get the deal cancelled. Joe Mears promised Jimmy that the club would hire the very best lawyer to get the contract cancelled. Remember this statement. Joe Mears lied. Jimmy didn't realise that Milan had paid £10,000 up front and Joe Mears had spent the money and Chelsea was skipped. Run Paul of the Bailey, or Mr. R.I. Lewis. Lewis was one of the best in the legal profession. He was a large, colourful character, sometimes bombastic, occasionally blustering, but in his thinking, sharp as a razor. Jimmy asked a mate to go with him to Milan, and Mr. Lewis said he would follow on later. The weather was blazing hot, so Jimmy and his pal dressed in polo shirts, light trousers and slip-on shoes when they attended the meeting. Lewis wore a dark woolen 3-piece suit, a starched wing-collared shirt and a bowler hat, and in one hand he was carrying a furled umbrella, in the other a bulging briefcase, and over his arm was draped a heavy worsted overcoat. Run Paul of the Bailey was played by Leo McKern and was apparently based on Mr. R.I. Lewis. The meeting. The meeting took place at the home of AC Milan president Signor Spadaccini. Manager Giuseppe Viani and other club officials were also present. Jimmy and his mate had to sit outside like 2 naughty schoolboys. After 20 minutes, Lewis emerged from the meeting and said, "Good news and bad news, Jimmy. I'm afraid I've been unable to get you out of the deal, as they've taken up their option, and you are now an AC Milan player. The good news is that I've got you an extra tenner a week." Jimmy was more than disappointed. He was absolutely gutted, but thought that Chelsea had done everything possible to get the contract annulled. New country, new challenge. Already Jimmy was a goal-scoring legend, nothing but success from a personal point of view. But now he was about to embark on a different journey. How would it turn out? The photo shows Jimmy and Irene arriving in Milan in 1961 with Jimmy Hill behind them. What would the future hold for the young couple? Success, happiness, and loads of lovely lira? The size of Jimmy's suitcase suggests he wasn't planning to stay long in Milan. As a last desperate measure, Jimmy had asked Jimmy Hill to try and get the deal scrapped. The parting of the ways was inevitable. Chelsea chairman Joel Mears sold Jimmy to AC Milan in June '61 for £80,000. He was given a 3-year contract on £140 a week with a £15,000 signing bonus. Managers Giuseppe Viani and Nerio Rocco would influence Jimmy's time in Italy. Jimmy called Rocco a raving maniac and said he was treated as the enemy. In the photographs on the left, Joe Mears, top is Giuseppe Viani, who would suffer a heart attack and die before the season started, and at the bottom is Nerio Rocco, who treated Jimmy as the enemy. Apparently he hated the British. Was it doomed from the start? Jimmy had got on well with Viani, and despite the photo with Rocco appearing friendly, it quickly deteriorated. Rocco was called the Mad King of Catenaccio. Catenaccio, or the chain, can be translated as the door bolt, which implies a highly organised and effective backline defence, focused on nullifying opponents' attacks and preventing goal-scoring opportunities. Before the European Cup final in 1969 against Ajax, he instructed his players to kick anything that moved, and they followed his instructions to the letter. Ajax played total football, but Cruyff was shut out in a 4-1 defeat. Greaves, the chirpy Cockney, would never have been happy in a regime such as that. Start of a new season. Giuseppe Viani had suffered a heart attack and died, and the new head coach was Rocco, who believed in a strict training regime with little personal freedom. Jimmy scored on his debut against Vicenza at San Siro. He scored 9 goals in 14 appearances, including 1 against Inter Milan. During a match against Sampdoria, Jimmy kicked a player who had spat on him, and Sampdoria equalised from the free kick. Rocco blamed Greaves, even though he had scored 1 and set up another. Jimmy was transfer listed, and Brazilian Dino Sani was signed to replace him, scoring 14 goals in 63 games. Sani moved into their apartment, while Jimmy and Irene had to move to the Intercontinental Hotel, which could not be described as luxurious. Escape from purgatory. A knock on the door. Is Jimmy Greaves in? He's training but should be home soon. Would you like to come in and wait? You don't know me, do you? I do. You are the saviour who has come to rescue us. Irene welcomed Bill Nicholson into the flat and made him a cup of tea. On the right is the less than luxurious Intercontinental Hotel, where Jimmy and Irene had been moved and where Nicholson called to see them. Was this the end of the saga? Chelsea offered 90,000, but this was a smokescreen to keep their fans happy, thinking that the club were serious bidders. They didn't have 90,000 pence. The bidding reached 96,000 when Bill Nicholson went back to Milan. Bill then ended all speculation by offering £99,999, and Milan accepted. The photograph, Jimmy sat on the top of a fence surrounding his prison camp. Duplicity at Stamford Bridge. 40 years later, in 2000, Jimmy was the guest speaker at the sporting dinner. He was signing autographs when a lady approached him and said, "You don't know me, but you knew my father, John Battersby, Secretary of Chelsea." Throughout his life, my father always felt very bad about the circumstances surrounding your move to AC Milan. Jimmy said, "It's water under the bridge, and Chelsea did everything they could to stop the move." You don't know, do you? That's why my father felt so bad about your treatment. Joe Mears didn't hire Lewis to get you out of the deal, but to make damn sure it went through, because they were absolutely desperate for money. They were skint. Another example of a chairman's duplicity, as Joe Mears sat with Jimmy and blatantly lied when he told him he would hire the best lawyer possible to get him out of the Milan deal, but he did just the opposite. White Hart Lane beckons. Bill Nicholson is putting the well-worn chequebook of Tottenham back in his pocket as he escorts Jimmy to his new home of White Hart Lane. Back in London in December '61, and Jimmy was joining the team that had just won the league and cup double. How would he fit into a team that had been so successful, and would the players be resentful? Danny Blanchflower welcomed him into the Spurs family, and Jimmy admired Danny so much he named his son, who was born in 1963, after the Tottenham captain. Change the black and red of AC Milan for... It's often surprising to look at the colours your favourite team plays in. I asked a friend of mine who was a director of Tottenham, Paul Barber, to have a change of strip of red. He said he would most likely get lynched because of Arsenal. I told him that's no excuse, Paul. Paul has been Chief Executive Officer at Brighton Hove Albion since 2012. In the first photo, Spurs copied the strip of Blackburn Rovers, who had been very successful in the 1890s. But then two strips with red followed, hence my suggestion. The strips on the right were copied from the famous Preston North End Invincibles team that came in turn from Corinthians Football Club. The hero returned at Plymouth for the reserves on December 9, 1961. The Plymouth chairman strode out to the centre circle and welcomed Jimmy back to England, and the cheers went round the ground, filled with 13,500 spectators. Spurs won 4-1 and Jimmy scored twice. All the kids wanted Jim's autograph. He was back in England though, happy and scoring goals. The future was bright. Football League refused Spurs permission to play Jimmy in a league match. Bill and Jimmy were summoned to the Grand Hotel Sheffield on Friday, December 15th, 1961. They were made to sit outside the meeting room for 2 hours, like naughty schoolboys, before being called in. There were 8 members on the committee, 2 of them fast asleep, and the table was full of empty wine bottles, brandy bottles and plates, showing that they had dined well. League Secretary Alan Hardacre asked Bill, "Were there any under-the-counter shenanigans or anything untoward?" Bill answered no. "Then yon Greaves fella is cleared to play. Good afternoon, gentlemen," replied the xenophobic Hardacre before dismissing them with a laconic wave of his hand. Bill was not best pleased, in fact he was irate. They dragged us up here so they could have a good trophy. On the train back to London, Bill asked Jim if he was okay and said, "You were playing against Blackpool tomorrow." Jimmy's name wasn't even on the match day programme. That brings us to the end of part 1 of the extraordinary Jimmy Greaves story. Jimmy nervous on his first team debut for Spurs? I don't think Jimmy was ever nervous on a football field. December 16th, 61, and Spurs played Blackpool at White Hart Lane. In a 5-2 win, Les Allen scored 2 and Jimmy hit another hat-trick, including a flying bicycle kick that is still remembered by fans of my generation. He went on to score 30 goals in 29 League and Cup games. Tottenham finished in 3rd place, 1 point behind Burnley and 4 behind champions Ipswich, whom they lost twice to. So could they have won another double? Bill Nicholson would sell Les Allen, who scored 27 goals in the double season, in July 1965 to QPR for £21,000. A deal Bill always regretted. And Les won the Football League Cup in 1967 with QPR. The photo shows Jimmy's first Spurs goal. Left to right are Tony Waiters in the goal, Les Allen, Glyn James, Jimmy Greaves and Roy Grattricks. Spurs lost both games against Ipswich Town, managed by the great Alf Ramsey, mainly because when Danny Blanchflower came up with a game plan to beat Ipswich, Dave Mackay went mad, saying we can beat these country boys and we shouldn't change our game for anybody. In the Charity Shield game on April 11th, 1962 at Ipswich, Spurs hammered Ipswich 5-1 when the team played as Danny Blanchflower suggested, with goals from Medwin, White, Smith and 2 from Jimmy Greaves. They could have won another double. Football's golden oldies from the Toll House in Lancaster, Part 2. 1962 FA Cup final against Burnley. Jimmy tried to lift the tension in the dressing room by saying he would score in the 4th minute. Wrong again, Jim. The Duke of Edinburgh shook Jimmy's hand and said, "I thought you were in Italy." At which point Blanchflower said, "No, sir. We brought him back and he cost a fortune, believe me." Kick-off, 3 minutes into the game and Jimmy scores. The players from left to right are Alex Elder, Adam Blacklow, the goalkeeper, Tommy Cummings, Bobby Smith, Jimmy Adamson and the sliding Brian Miller trying to stop Jimmy shooting. Happy Jimmy, light years away from Milan. The first photo shows Ron Henry, Cliff Jones, Dave Mackay, Jimmy Greaves, Morris Swede Norman, Bobby Smith and Bill Hovis Brown. The second photo is John White and Cliff Jones invariably sat next to each other for team photographs, inseparable friends, and one of the few times they were separated, save Cliff's life. European conquest in 1963. Spurs win the European Cup Winners' Cup against Atletico Madrid. The first British team to win a European competition. A 5-1 win for Spurs, Greaves 2, White and Dyson 2, the scorers. Spurs beat Rangers 8-4, Slovan Bratislava 6-2. My wife and I watched this game on our honeymoon, and OFK Belgrade 5-2 to reach the final, where Atletico were on £360 a man to retain the trophy. Before the game, Nicholson was so depressed because Mackay wasn't fit to play, and he went through the entire Madrid team and made them out to be superstars. Before Danny Blanchflower stood up and said, "Wait a minute, Bill, we're not a bad side ourselves. We have a fearsome centre-half who takes his teeth out before the game and still bites anyone who comes near him. We have the greatest winger in the world who can catch pigeons and a guy up front who can score goals with chains on his legs, and the rest of us won the double in England. Nicholson would never talk like this again before a game. The left photo shows Jimmy Greaves scoring from a Cliff Jones cross after 15 minutes. The second photo, standing, Jimmy Greaves, Swede Norman, Bill Brown, John White, Bobby Smith, Tony Markey, who took the place of the injured Dave Mackay. The front, Terry Dyson, Ron Henry, Danny Blanchflower, Peter Baker and Cliff Jones. Greaves could score on any stage. On the 100th anniversary of the Football Association, England played the rest of the world on October 23rd, 1963 and won 2-1. Gordon Banks, Jimmy Armfield and Ray Wilson were the fullbacks. Gordon Mill, Maurice Norman, Bobby Moore were the halfbacks. Terry Payne with a goal, Jimmy Greaves with a goal, Bobby Smith, George Easton and Bobby Charlton. That was the team. Yashin, Santos, Schnellinger, Pluskal, Popular, Mazepust. And that half-back line all came from Austria. Koper, Dennis Law, who scored, Di Stefano, Eusebio and Hento. Pelé was injured and ruled out of the match. 1964 broke another record. Jimmy scored his 100th goal for Spurs against West Bromwich Albion. He takes time to present the ball to his dad, Jim, at White Hart Lane. Jimmy always worried Bill Shankly. At White Hart Lane in 1965, he continued to torment defenders. And you can see Ron Yates and Smith there being mesmerised by Jimmy's footwork. This time it was Ron Yates and Tommy Smith of Liverpool, two of the toughest defenders in the league. Ian St John recalls that when Bill Shankly gave his team talk, the only player he ever warned his defenders about was Jimmy Greaves. Seeing Tommy Smith there reminds me of the time at Anfield when he passed a note to Jimmy as they ran onto the pitch. Jimmy said, "What's this?" "Just read it," said Tommy. It was the menu for the intensive care unit at Liverpool General Hospital. Jimmy saw the funny side. More hat-tricks for England than anyone. Johnny Haynes, Bobby Smith and Jimmy Greaves on duty for England. And look at the state of the pitch. Check out the state of the pitches. No grass, just mud. Hat-tricks for England after Jimmy were Lineker 5, Charlton 4, Woodward 4 and Mortensen 3. All roads lead to the '66 World Cup. Alf Ramsey had guaranteed that England would win the World Cup in 1966. Nobody believed it. Alf also said he would win the World Cup without Greaves and Moore. On a tour of Europe, the team coach was passing the Gypsy encampment and Greaves and Moore shouted, "Stop the bus so Alf can visit his relatives." Alf's nickname was Darky, same as his father, and because of his looks, this link with gypsies was suggested, but never proved. Alf was absolutely furious and said to Harold Shepherdson, who was sitting next to him, "I'll win the World Cup without those two bastards." As things turned out, Jimmy missed the final with injury, and Bobby Moore was almost replaced with Norman Hunter on the eve of the final. Jimmy contracts hepatitis on Bonfire Night 1965. The illness drained him of energy, strength and stamina. He worked every day in the gym to get his fitness back and hardly touched alcohol in that time. Many weeks later, on March 19, 1966, Jimmy returned and scored in a 5-5 draw with Aston Villa at had lost a yard of pace, which his specialist had predicted. In 10 league games to the end of the season, he only scored 1 goal from open play, plus 2 penalties, something that had never happened before in his career. England went on tour, and Alf rested Jimmy against Finland, but brought him back for the game against Norway. Jimmy scored 4 in a 6-1 win, and I'm certain that performance convinced Alf to play him in the first group game against Uruguay at Wembley. Alf thought Jimmy had rediscovered his Midas touch, but the hepatitis left a mark on Jimmy that he never shook off. He was never the same player again. A dream is ended. Third group game, and Joseph Bonella, France, ends Jimmy's dream of playing in a World Cup final. Jimmy had between 5 and 15 stitches in a leg wound, depending on which report you read. After the game, Alf was interviewed by journalists and said Greaves has a gash on his leg that will require 2 stitches. He could never be fit to play in the final in 10 days' time. When asked how he felt when Alf Ramsey left him out of the team, Jimmy replied, "Alf didn't leave me out of the final, Joseph Bonnell did." FA Cup win in 1967. Mike England and Jimmy Greaves celebrate the 2-1 win over Chelsea with a pint of milk. Last game for skipper Dave Mackay, who would leave in 1968 to join Derby County. Jimmy was the only Spurs player left from the team that won the European Cup Winners' Cup in '63. Dave Mackay had been injured for the '63 final. The photo on the back row is Joe Kinnear, Knowles, England, Jennings, Gilzean, Mullery. Front we've got Robertson, Greaves, Mackay, Venables and Stoll. That was a very good team, but not as good as the double team that Bill tried to emulate. Shankly's grand piano example. You need 8 players to carry a grand piano and 3 players to play the damn thing. Jimmy was unhappy in '67-68. He played 44 League and Cup games and found the net 26 times. He often felt tired and jaded, certainly the effects of the hepatitis. Nicholson noticed his depression and tried to pull him out of it by buying Martin Chiffers, with Alan Gilzean dropping to a deep role. The fire seemed to have gone out of the team, with Dave Mackay going to Derby and Cliff Jones to Fulham. Alf picked him for 3 international squads late in 1967 and the first 2 in 1968, but Jimmy never got to play. Jimmy told Alf that if he wasn't going to play, he would rather he didn't select him and he would concentrate his energy on Spurs. Would 68-69 be better for Jim? The combination of an extended contract and not being in the England setup rekindled his fire and proved the antidote. Spurs finished in 6th place and reached the semi-finals of the League Cup, with Jimmy scoring 36 goals in total for the season, way in front of runners-up George Best and Ron Davies. Yet another golden boot, his 6th and last. He had recaptured his enthusiasm and his touch for goals. He scored 4 hat-tricks and a 4-timer in a 5-1 win over Sunderland. A goal against Stoke City in November was his 200th goal for Tottenham. At the age of 29, who could have imagined that the end was in sight for this truly magnificent player? In 69-70s, Spurs were in transience. Maybe shambolic is more accurate. Bill Nicholson introduced youngsters to the side. but they were young and inconsistent. Two terrible results against Derby 5-0 and Sunderland 1-0, which was Steve Perryman's debut, and the media and fans went to town with fierce criticism. Following these games, Spurs won only 5 of the next 17 games and found themselves embroiled in a relegation battle before finally finishing in 11th place. On January 3rd, 1970, my 28th birthday, Steve Perryman travelled to Bradford City in the FA Cup third round, and instead of going on the team coach, Steve was invited to go by car with Dave Mackay and Jimmy Greaves. They stopped on the way and had a roast dinner, and Jimmy sank 3 pints before playing in the game and scoring in a 2-2 draw. Spurs won the replay at White Hart Lane 5-0, with goals from Jimmy Greaves 2, Jimmy Pearce 2 and Roger Morgan. Bill Nicholson was urged to clear out the dead wood in the side and obliged by dropping Gilzean, Knowles, Kinnear and Jimmy Greaves against Southampton on January 31st, 1970, which they lost 1-0. Jimmy was never picked for the first team again and played his final game for the club in March 1970 against Plymouth Reserves, where it all began in 1961. Transfer deadline day, March 16th, 1970. 2 moves on the same day. Jimmy and Irene were moving house from Hulton Moor, Essex to Upminster. The telephone rang and Bill Nicholson said, "I've got Martin Peters with me. He's coming to Tottenham for 200,000 and you will go the other way for 90,000 in part exchange. We no longer want you at the club. Your services are not required at Tottenham, and that's it." Jimmy said that if he could turn back the clock, it would be to this day, and he would say to Bill, "Let's think this through," and I would probably have stayed at Spurs, won my place back because there wasn't anybody else to take it away from me. It was the second saddest day of my life. Jimmy didn't have to move, as he had 18 months left on his contract, but he was annoyed and upset with Bill, so he hastily agreed to move. He could have gone to Derby County, as Brian Clough had approached him to join Dave Mackay, but Jimmy didn't want to move his family to Derby. From 65-66, when he had hepatitis, to 69-70, 4 years, and Jimmy only had one Renaissance season where he reached his former heights, 68-69. Another debut. West Ham had won 1 out of 8 games when Jimmy made his debut, and of course he scored against Man City at Main Road in a 5-1 win. 48 hours of incessant rain had turned the pitch into a quagmire. Jimmy found the training lax and team affairs disorganised and shambolic. Fertile ground for a disenchanted footballer who had begun to drink more heavily than was good for him. The final season, 70-71 with West Ham. First game of the season, Spurs versus West Ham, ended 2-2 and Jimmy scored for West Ham. By now, Jimmy was drinking heavily with plenty of help from Bobby Moore, Frank Lampard Sr., Harry Redknapp and Jeff Hurst, plus many others. He became increasingly downcast again about West Ham's game and thoroughly miserable about his own. At West Ham, his natural talent for scoring goals had deserted him, and he didn't possess the will to work hard and rediscover it. Jimmy had also discovered a passion for rally driving, which had driven Nicholson crazy. The final straw, a genius drowns in alcohol. New Year's Eve 1970, West Ham were due to play Blackpool the next day in the FA Cup. With the pitch covered in ice and the heavy frost forecast, Jimmy and Bobby Moore, Brian Deere and Clyde Best, who only drank orange, headed for the 007 club of Brian London and drank a few beers, believing the game would be called off. They got to bed around 2:30 in the morning and rose at 10 o'clock for breakfast. Unbelievably, the game went ahead and West Ham lost 4-0. Jimmy still feels angry at the way manager Ron Greenwood handled the situation. Greenwood dropped all 4 players and Jimmy never spoke to Greenwood again because he had made them scapegoats by talking to the press. Jimmy's drinking was now in the early stages of alcoholism, and the thrill, excitement and buzz had disappeared. He left West Ham in May 1971, not only leaving football but life itself and family living. Jimmy's career in numbers, astonishing. 35 goals a year over 14 years speaks volumes. 34 hat-tricks in his career, 15 at Spurs, 13 at Chelsea and 6 for England. All 3 are the most ever. Jimmy had interests off the pitch. Jimmy had gone into business with his brother-in-law Tom. 1963 and the lorry is part of a thriving haulage business. By 1970 the various businesses they ran had a turnover of over £1 million, but they couldn't fill the hole that football left in Jimmy's life. School pal Dave Emmerich to the rescue. Dave saw that his old school pal Jimmy was missing the game, so he said to him, "Why don't you come and play for Brentwood Town? The pay is £3 a game." Jimmy made his debut on December 27th, 1975 in a 2-0 defeat to Witham Town. His return to the game was so successful that he signed for Chelmsford City for the 1976-77 season in the Southern League and scored 20 goals in 38 games in front of crowds of 2,000 plus. Jimmy was still struggling with his drinking and sought help from Alcoholics Anonymous. In August 1977, although still struggling, he signed for Barnet after being invited by Chairman Dave Underwood and scored 25 goals, being voted Player of the Season. Jimmy always said that the best goal he ever scored was for Barnet. Jimmy described the goal at many after-dinner functions he attended, saying, "The centre-half was giving me a bit of stick, so I went to the edge of the box. And when the ball came to me, I hit it, and it went like a rocket towards the right-hand corner of the net, before swerving unbelievably and going into the net in the left-hand corner. The best goal of my career at 38 years of age." He chose to leave the club in 1978 to confront his illness, despite manager Barry Fry pleading with him to stay. In 1978, Jimmy began to turn his life around. His son Danny said, "Dan almost became a recluse, sitting in a room on his own drinking and listening to Neil Diamond records. That wasn't really the dad we loved and adored." His daughter Lynn took her dad to Worley Mental Hospital to dry out in 1978. Billy Connolly was actually talking about the pitfalls of alcohol and said, "It doesn't make you clever, and the day I found out I was in a phone box and I couldn't get out, and it's hardly Hampton Court Maze, is it?" It had previously been called Essex County Lunatic Asylum. She said, "We called at a nearby pub before going into the hospital, and Dad had a pint of Guinness and a brandy, and I'm very proud to say he never had another drink for the rest of his life." He moved effortlessly into the world of television. There was Morecambe and Wise, and then from 1985 to 1992 there was St and Greaves, watched by over 5 million fans. We were just two old players playing off the cuff, said Ian, who had worked on the ball in London before joining Jimmy, who worked on Star Soccer in the Midlands. Following Jim's second stroke in 2015, Ian said, "I can't even phone him now because he can't have a phone conversation. And he was clever, sharp, bright and very funny. I miss him terribly." The show worked because St John could never keep a straight face for long, and he remembers the time when they did the show with a spitting image puppet of Greaves, who was unwell, with Peter Brackley under the table, impersonating Jim's distinctive drawl. Hilarious. Two great friends. Jimmy said he worked for Sky, but Saint didn't fancy it. Going up the ladders to erect Sky dishes wasn't for him. Typical Jim. At some stage in those magical 7 years, the name of Marco Tardelli, 1972 to 1988, the Italian footballer, cropped up. And Greaves said to Saint, "He's responsible for more scar tissue than all the surgeons at Harefield Hospital." What a great comment about a very good player. None of the present-day commentators would dare to talk like Greaves. For 7 years they brought humour into football, and then Sky Sports became the puppet masters. There was room in football punditry for two men who retained the code which bound them to the audience they entertained, rather than the masters who paid them. How different from the inanity of the comment that passes for analysis nowadays. When a match of the day programme highlighted Newcastle's relegation 2008 to 9, not once did their punditry during the final 8 games of the season attach any blame to the man whose job it was to inspire them. Alan Shearer, he who had spent most of the campaign in the same studio judging others. Shearer won 1, drew 2 and lost 5. So how is it that Alan Shearer comments on football? For Greaves, it was a sad indictment of the football world that had changed for the worse. Jimmy said the aspect of the type of work we did changed with the big television contract of the Premier League. Football wants maximum publicity and all the good things from television. Television is then frightened to adopt any other attitude because they don't want to rock the boat. Talking about puppets, it was always fun. Meeting a future president of the USA. In 1991, Greaves and St John travelled to America to see the preparations for the 1994 World Cup, and also to make the draw for the 1991-92 Rumbelows Cup. A chance meeting with Donald Trump's English secretary led them to the boardroom. Greaves drew the home team and Trump the away team. The first tie drawn was number 8 versus number 7. Spurs versus Norwich City, which Spurs won 2-1. Donald Trump didn't have a clue who Jimmy and Ian were, and he knew nothing about soccer, which is not unusual. Geoffrey Green of the Times said Jim's scoring style was like closing the door of a Rolls Royce. Jimmy and Irene had a wonderful life. It was a love story. Surrounded by 6 of their 10 grandchildren, who they call the Klingons. When they visit, Irene says, "It's life, Jim, but not as we know it." You will have seen the heartbreaking pictures of Jimmy following his stroke. I prefer to remember him as he was, an artist at the top of his craft, In the vanguard with Di Stefano, Finney, Matthews, Lowe, Pelly and the rest. Interview with Brian Moore around 1990. About 1990, Brian Moore interviewed Jimmy Greaves and they talked about the whole of Jimmy's career, but one of Jim's disclosures surprised Brian. When Greaves said he should never have gone to West Ham United when he had the chance to join Brian Clough at Derby County, the best manager of them all in Jimmy's eyes, Moore was surprised, but it was true. Jimmy always wanted to be an inside forward and said there were many terrific players like Wilf Mannion and Rach Carter, but his hero was the great Len Shackleton, who did unexpected things on the field, like putting spin on the ball or taking the ball round the goalkeeper, then sitting on it on the goal line before backing it into the net. The best passer of a ball he ever saw was Johnny Ames, former England captain, who didn't just pass the ball to a colleague's feet, but placed it so he could simply run onto it in stride. Greatest Spurs 11. Steve Perryman asked me to select my greatest Tottenham 11. Spurs fans have been asked the same question and came up with the usual names, omitting everyone from Spurs' first 60 years. Steve was flabbergasted that I made 9 changes to the fans' selection. After a short discussion, he accepted my team, a bit like Brian Clough debating something with his players. The fans' choice was Pat Jennings, Steve Perryman, Mike England, Ledley King, Cyril Knowles, Dave Mackay, Glenn Hoddle, Ozzy Ardiles, Paul Gascoigne, Jimmy Greaves and Gareth Bale. Greatest of all time, known in American sporting language as the GOAT. At the age of 15, he scored 51 goals for Chelsea youth team. At 16, he scored 122. Chelsea total goals, 132 in 169 appearances. 60-61 at AC Milan, 9 goals in 14 appearances. Tottenham Hotspur, 266 goals in 379 appearances. 70-71 at West Ham United, 13 goals in 44 appearances. England, 44 goals in 57 games. 34 hat-tricks, 15 for Spurs, most ever, 13 for Chelsea, most ever, and 6 for England, the most ever. Major honours, Serie A, 1962, FA Cup, 62 and 67, Cup Winners' Cup, 63, World Cup, 1966. 464 goals in 659 appearances, including 6 golden boots. I hope I have done Jimmy justice, but I'm sure he'll forgive me if I omitted any goals. And remember, whenever he is compared to other great players like Dixie Dean or Tommy Lawton, they were centre forwards. Goals scored in a single match. 8 for Chelsea youth against Fulham. 7 for Chelsea youth against Crystal Palace. 5 for Chelsea versus Wolves in 1958. 5 for Chelsea against North End in 59. 5 for Chelsea against West Brom in 1960. 4 for Chelsea against Portsmouth in 1957. 4 for Chelsea against Newcastle in 1960. 4 for Chelsea against Notts Forest in 1960. 4 for Spurs against Notts Forest in 1962. 4 for Spurs against Liverpool in 63. 4 for Spurs against Sunderland in 68. 4 for England against Northern Ireland in 63. 4 for England against Norway in 66. These scoring exploits of Jimmy seem as though they are from a different world. I wonder why they haven't been repeated by any player over the at least 5 decades and maybe 7 decades since. Nobody now scores 5, 4 or very rarely a hat-trick. Royal Mail published a set of first-class stamps in 2013. The stamps were published to mark the 150th anniversary of the Football Association. The back row on the left, you've got Jimmy Greaves, John Charles, Gordon Banks, George Best, John Barnes. The front row, you've got Kevin Keegan, Dennis Lowe, Bobby Moore, Brian Robson, Dave Mackay, Bobby Charlton. Memories are simply a footpath to a wonderful place called nostalgia. From Ragamuffin to Goat. With his mate Freddie Little in the strip of Fanshawe All Boys, Jim's Heroes. Jim in the strip of the 4 clubs he played for, Chelsea, Tottenham Hotspur, AC Milan and West Ham United. My biggest regret was leaving White Hart Lane in 1970. I was heartbroken, said Jim. Bill Nicholson did not treat Jimmy as he should have, and his reputation, in my eyes, is severely tarnished forever as a manager. Jimmy won 6 Golden Boot awards, beating Steve Bloomer, who had 5. Anyone who saw Jimmy play was blessed with good fortune. To me, he was the Rembrandt of football, and I hope you enjoyed my tribute.